In 1960, the entire human race combined was worth about $1.37 trillion.
Which is just a wild number to think about.
Right. I mean, that was the sum total of every factory, every farm, every transaction, every paycheck on the planet. Just 1.37 trillion. But today, that number has exploded past $100 trillion.
Yeah, it's a massive leap.
It is. But here's the question we are basically obsessing over today. Are we actually richer? Or are we just, running much, much faster on a significantly more expensive treadmill?
Yeah, and that is, it's the ultimate macroeconomic illusion to untangle, really. Because a 70-fold increase in raw wealth, I mean, that sounds like an absolute victory until you actually look at the environmental collateral and the demographic debt we took on to achieve it.
Right, exactly. And to figure out what is real and what is just a mirage, we're going deep into the World Development Indicators, or the WDI.
The big ledger.
The ultimate ledger, yeah.
Yeah.
We are looking at the raw, unfiltered data spanning from 1960 through the 2020s. And if you are listening to this, whether you're, prepping for a global strategy meeting or trying to make sense of your own retirement portfolio or just insanely curious about how the world works, you should know these aren't opinion pieces.
Right, no think tank editorials here.
Exactly. We aren't looking at political manifestos. This is the closest thing we have to a definitive mathematical accounting of human existence.
It's a massive undertaking by global institutions to track, well, everything. Births, deaths, emissions, female labor participation, sovereign debt, literacy rates, all of it.
Yeah.
It really forces you to look at the structural reality of our species, just stripping away the daily news cycle completely.
And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack that structural transformation. We are going to look at this unprecedented explosion of prosperity and the incredible victories over human mortality.
Which are huge.
They are. But we are also going to dig into the largely hidden bills that are just now coming due. Because the era of easy growth is, well, it's over. And the data proves it.
There's absolutely no free lunch on the macroeconomic dashboard. I mean, every leap in life expectancy or economic output, it required a trade-off. And we are currently living in the window where those trade-offs have to be reconciled.
So let's unpack this. We have to start with the most obvious metric of progress, the one that makes the world go round and the one that generated that massive headline number.
Money.
A great scorecard.
It's a great scorecard. We started with this mind-bending statistic, gross national income, globally skyrocketing from roughly $1.37 trillion in 1960 to over $100 trillion in the modern era.
Yeah.
And if we look at gross domestic product per capita, so basically slicing that massive economic pie by the number of people on Earth, it jumped from a mere $452 per person in 1960 to over $12,600 per person today.
On a simple line graph, it literally looks like a rocket launch, just a completely vertical trajectory. But, I mean, $100 trillion feels like a fake number.
Oh, totally.
I look at those figures, and my immediate thought is that we'd, abandoned the gold standard, central banks started printing money, and we multiplied a bunch of zeros on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, inflation is the big elephant in the room there.
Right. I mean, my grandfather could buy a loaf of bread for a nickel, and a house cost a few $1,000s.
Yeah.
So if we are factoring in 60 years of inflation, are we actually generating more value, or is this just fiat currency playing tricks on us?
That is the necessary friction to introduce right away. Because if you just look at current U.S. dollars, you're going to get a wildly distorted view of human progress.
Yeah.
The WDI data anticipates this, though, which is why we have to look at the metrics adjusted for purchasing power parity, specifically pegged to constant 2021 international dollars.
I've seen that term a million times, purchasing power parity, or PPP. But let's actually break down the mechanics of how they calculate that, because I think it gets glossed over a lot.
It does get glossed over, but it's brilliant. PPP asks a very grounded question, like, what can your money actually buy in your local market?
Okay.
Because a dollar in New York does not buy the same amount of groceries or housing as a dollar in Mumbai or Lagos.
Right. Obviously.
And a dollar in 2020, New York doesn't buy what a dollar in 1960 New York bought.
Mm-hmm.
So economists create a hypothetical basket of goods.
Like literal groceries.
Groceries.
Yeah.
But also housing, transportation, healthcare, raw materials, a massive standardized basket of the things human punks and businesses actually consume day to day.
Got it.
Then they measure how much local currency it takes to buy that exact same basket in different countries and across different decades. PPP equalizes the purchasing power by eliminating those price differences.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it strips out the noise of inflation, and it strips out currency manipulation by central banks. It gives us a constant currency to measure actual, tangible human output.
Okay, so it filters out the funny money.
Exactly.
So if we apply that filter, if we look at the data adjusted for PPP, in constant 2021 dollars, does the rocket launch trajectory flatten out?
It doesn't flatten out at all.
Wait, really?
Really. The growth curve is still absolutely explosive, even when you account for every single drop of inflation. The growth of human output is a genuine, unprecedented historical anomaly. We are producing exponentially more real goods and real services than our grandparents could have possibly imagined.
So the pie really did get fundamentally large.
Vastly larger.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I am visualizing the structural change correctly, because it can't just be that we are manufacturing 70 times more, like pairs of shoes.
Right, the composition of the wealth changed.
Okay, so if we look at the 1960 global economy, it's like looking at a localized mom-and-pop general store. It provides what the neighborhood needs, it operates on a small scale, and the margins are tight. But the 2020s economy, that isn't just a bigger mom-and-pop shop. That is a sprawling, hyper-connected, multinational conglomerate. It has automated supply chains, massive capital reserves, and it operates 2047.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
Right.
And crucially, the multinational conglomerate sells entirely different products than the general store did.
Right.
In the WDI data, we see this incredible shift in trade. Merchandise trade, shipping physical boxes of things across oceans. It grew massively, going from about 17% of global GDP in 1960 to over 40% today.
Okay, some more physical stuff.
Yes, but the real story is the explosion of commercial service exports.
Meaning intangible goods.
Intangible value, software, financial derivatives, digital services, consulting, intellectual property. The data shows commercial service exports ballooning from a little over $1 trillion in the 1990s to over $4.5 trillion today.
Wow.
We moved from an economy that primarily extracted and shaped physical matter to an economy that trades human thought and digital architecture.
And you can see the infrastructure for that shift right in the data, actually. There's a section tracking telecommunications. In 1990, mobile cellular subscriptions were essentially zero, just a flat line.
Yeah, basically non-existent.
Today, it's approaching universal coverage. We basically handed a supercomputer to the majority of the human race. And fixed broadband penetration went from 0 to nearly 20% globally. We wired the planet to facilitate that intangible trade.
Which brings up a really important nuance about how we measure this new wealth. Because GDP is just raw output. It's the total revenue of the global conglomerate. But any business owner will tell you that revenue is not profit.
Right. If I make $1 million, but my overhead is $900,000, I'm not a millionaire.
Exactly. And this is where the WDI introduces a much sharper metric, adjusted net national income.
Okay. What does that adjust for?
This accounts for the depreciation of fixed capital, the wear and tear on the machines, the buildings, the physical infrastructure that we use to generate that GDP.
Ah, I see.
Like, if a country builds a massive port facility, that adds to GDP today. But as the concrete cracks and the cranes rust over the next 20 years, that depreciation is a structural cost.
It's the cost of maintaining the treadmill.
Yes. Adjusted net national income subtracts that cost to show what we are actually netting as a species. And the per capita figure here is still triumphant, starting around $695 in the early years and growing to over $6,400 per capita.
So even after maintenance, we are way ahead.
Right. It proves that our net wealth, our actual take-home pay, after fixing the leaky roof and replacing the broken gears, has profoundly increased.
But I'm looking at another metric right next to that in the data, and it feels like a massive trapdoor opening under this entire economic celebration. Adjusted savings.
Yeah, that's the one.
Because if adjusted net national income accounts for the wear and tear on our machines, adjusted savings accounts for the wear and tear on the planet, right?
It is the single most sobering metric in the entire data set, honestly.
Right.
True wealth isn't just what you produce in a given year. It is what you keep and what you preserve for the future.
Right.
The WDI data calculates natural resource depletion, the value of the oil, the minerals, the forests that we extract and burn.
So to use an analogy, if I inherit a sprawling estate with a massive ancient forest on it, I could chop down every single tree this year and sell the timber. My personal GDP for 2024 would look phenomenal. I'd look incredibly wealthy on paper.
You'd look like an economic genius.
Yeah.
But your adjusted savings would be heavily negative.
Because the trees are gone.
Because you liquidated your baseline capital and disguised it as income. You can never sell those trees again. You didn't create wealth, you just transferred it from the future to the present.
Wow. We are getting incredibly rich, but we are burning our furniture to heat the house.
That's exactly what we're doing. And that theme, the depletion of natural capital to fund this mom and pop to multinational expansion, is the structural debt of the modern world. We are going to dive deeply into the specific environmental debt later, but you have to hold this tension in your mind. The $100 trillion economy is real, but it is heavily leveraged against the Earth.
Okay, so we've established the financial reality. The money is real, the digital interconnectedness is real, and the resource depletion is real. Let's pivot slightly. Let's talk about what all this wealth actually bought us.
Because humans didn't just build a $100 trillion economy so we could stare at larger bank balances.
Right. Wealth is ultimately a tool. And the most valuable thing that tool bought us was time.
It bought us survival.
Let's look at the human body. What did the GDP actually achieve for the average human being walking the earth? Because the numbers here regarding life expectancy and mortality, they don't just show progress. They show an entirely different paradigm of human existence.
The transformation in global health over the last 60 years is, objectively, the greatest achievement of our species.
In 1960, global life expectancy at birth was 50.9 years. Just let that sink in. Being born in 1960 meant it was essentially a coin flip whether you would live long enough to meet your grandchildren.
It's hard to even imagine that now.
It really is. Today, despite a slight dip during the recent pandemic, it has surged past 71, historically peaking near 72.9, almost 73 years. We engineered an extra 2 decades of life for the average human being.
And we should definitely note the persistent gender gap in that survival, too. The WDI tracks female and male life expectancy separately.
Right, there's always been a difference.
Yeah, female life expectancy rose from roughly 53 years to nearly 76 years. Male life expectancy rose from 49 years to roughly 71 years. Women have consistently outlived men, an advantage that held steady even as the absolute numbers skyrocketed.
Adding 20 years of life to billions of people is almost too vast to comprehend. But if we want to look at the mechanics of how we added those years, we have to look at the infant mortality rates. Because humans weren't necessarily aging faster in 1960.
No, they were just dying before they ever got the chance to age. Infant mortality is the heavy anchor that drags down average life expectancy. When you lift that anchor, the average shoots up.
And the data shows we didn't just lift it, we shattered it. In 1990, the infant mortality rate was roughly 64 deaths per 1,000 live births. Today, it is down to 27.2.
A massive drop.
And let's talk about absolute lives saved. In 1960, nearly 8.9 million infants died. Every single year. 8.9 million.
Learning a staggering baseline of tragedy that was just accepted as a normal part of the human condition.
By the modern era, despite a massive boom in the total human population, meaning there are way more babies being born now than in 1960, the absolute number of infant deaths dropped to 3.5 million.
It's incredible.
Under 5 deaths plummeted from nearly 13 million down to 4.7 million. There are no parades for the children who didn't die of diarrhea because their town finally got a water treatment plant, or the children who didn't die of measles because of cold chain vaccine distribution. It's a silent victory.
It really is. And let's connect that back to the wealth we discussed earlier. How exactly did GDP buy those lives?
Yeah, what's the mechanism?
It's not just about inventing medicines in a lab somewhere. It's about infrastructure. Vaccines are completely useless if you can't keep them cold during transport to a rural village. Clean water requires massive capital investment in pipes, pumps, and sanitation facilities.
Whoa, right.
The leap from a $1.3 trillion economy to a $100 trillion economy provided the tax base and the capital to build the physical scaffolding that keeps children alive.
So economic growth literally paved the roads that the ambulances drive on.
Exactly.
But you highlighted something fascinating from the more recent WDI data regarding how people are dying today. We solved a lot of the acute problems, but we traded them for an entirely new set of threats.
Yes. This is known in the data as the epidemiological transition.
The epidemiological transition. Okay, break that down.
The data shows a massive shift in the global mortality profile. We used to die primarily from communicable diseases, things you catch like cholera, tuberculosis, malaria, or from maternal and nutritional conditions.
Right.
As recently as 1990, these accounted for over 30% of global deaths. But as wealth and medicine beat those back, the non-communicable diseases expanded to fill the void.
Non-communicable meaning like heart disease, cancer, diabetes.
Right. The lifestyle diseases, the diseases of aging. The data shows non-communicable diseases now account for nearly 74% of all global deaths. It went from 60% to almost 74%.
Wow. So we survived the quick, infectious killers of the 20th century, only to run headfirst into the slow, chronic killers of the 21st century.
Precisely. And from an economic standpoint, those are significantly more expensive to treat. A vaccine costs a few dollars and solves the problem permanently. Managing a population's heart disease and diabetes requires decades of continuous, expensive medical intervention.
So it's a much heavier burden on the healthcare infrastructure.
Huge burden. And it highlights a recurring theme in the data. A quantitative victory often reveals a qualitative crisis.
That perfectly sets up another metric you pulled from the WDI regarding human capital. We talked about health, but let's talk about the brain power of this global population, the education data, because the quantitative victory there is undeniable. Adult literacy rates.
The march of global literacy is another stunning achievement. In 1975, global adult literacy was around 65%. A third of the adult population couldn't read a newspaper or sign a contract.
That's a huge chunk of humanity locked out of the modern economy.
Exactly. Today, it's over 87%. And crucially, the gender gap in youth literacy has almost completely closed in many regions. Young women are reading at the same rates as young men globally.
We built the schools, we got the kids into the classrooms. That's the quantitative victory. But what is the qualitative crisis hiding underneath it?
Learning poverty.
Learning poverty.
Yes. The WGI data tracks an incredibly alarming metric here. Learning poverty measures the percentage of children at late primary age, so roughly 10-year-olds, who cannot read and understand a simple age-appropriate text.
Okay.
And despite the massive increase in school enrollment, the learning poverty rate globally is still hovering around 48%. In some low and middle income regions, it is drastically higher.
Wait, I need to make sure I understand this. We have kids who are physically sitting in classrooms. They are technically enrolled in school, but they aren't actually acquiring basic cognitive skills. Almost half of them.
Half of them, yes. It's a systemic failure of quality. Building a concrete room and calling it a school is relatively easy. That takes raw GDP. But training highly qualified teachers, ensuring those teachers actually show up, because absenteeism is a massive issue in developing regions, providing adequate learning materials and ensuring that children are nourished enough to concentrate.
Yeah.
That is incredibly difficult.
So it links back to nutrition. If a child is suffering from stunting due to malnutrition, which we see in the poverty data, their cognitive development is impaired. Sitting them in a classroom won't magically fix the biological deficit.
Exactly. You can mandate schooling, but you can't mandate learning. And from a macroeconomic perspective, this is a ticking time bomb.
Because they can't participate in the economy.
Right. If half of your future workforce reaches adulthood functionally illiterate despite having a diploma, how are they going to participate in that high-tech, digital, commercial services economy we just talked about? They can't. They are locked out of the $100 trillion global market.
And speaking of being locked out of the market, there's another incredibly stubborn metric in the data regarding the workforce. We talked about women achieving parity in youth literacy. They are healthier, they are educated, and we know from the Women, Business, and the Law Index that legal frameworks around the world have steadily improved over the last 50 years to give women more property and mobility rights.
Yeah, the legal index score went from roughly 45.7 in the 1970s to over 72.4 today. Huge institutional progress.
Huge progress. And yet the global female labor force participation rate, it seems stuck.
It is entirely stagnant. Despite all the health and educational gains, global female labor force participation has fluctuated around 50% for decades.
And what's the male rate?
Meanwhile, the male participation rate is consistently over 70%.
Wow.
We have this massive reservoir of human capital, highly educated, healthy women whose economic potential is still structurally constrained by cultural norms, lack of childcare infrastructure, and informal barriers that the law hasn't been able to dismantle.
So we have all this potential energy just waiting to be unlocked. If you're a developing nation trying to double your GDP, the most obvious lever to pull isn't digging another coal mine, it's fixing the societal structures that keep half your talent pool on the sidelines.
It is the most glaring inefficiency in the global economy today, bar none.
Okay, so let's tie these threads together. We have kids surviving childhood. We have adults living 20 years longer. We have women entering the workforce, even if the progress is slower than we'd like. When you change survival rates and labor dynamics on a global scale, you fundamentally warp the shape of humanity.
You trigger a demographic earthquake.
Which brings us to the most fascinating and frankly the most concerning part of the WDI data, the demographic scissors. Because we are shifting from the triumph of health to the brutal mathematics of aging.
The data here is going to dictate the economic reality of the next 50 years. It's unavoidable.
Let's lay out the numbers. Population growth globally peaked in the early 1960s at roughly 2.11% annually. We were multiplying rapidly. But since then, it has been steadily plummeting, heading toward 1.2% and lower. We are slamming on the demographic brakes.
And we have to explain why we slammed on the brakes, because it traces directly back to the infant mortality data we discussed.
Right, the biological insurance policy. If I'm a farmer in 1960 and the infant mortality rate is sky high, I need to have 7 or 8 children just to guarantee that 2 or 3 survive to adulthood to work the farm and take care of me when I'm old.
Exactly. It's a rational economic decision. But when clean water and vaccines drop that infant mortality rate, parents realize their children are actually going to live. It takes a generation or two for the cultural mindset to adjust,
Right.
but eventually the crude birth rate collapses.
The data shows it went from 32 per thousand down to 16 per thousand. It literally cut in half.
Right. Families go from having 6 kids to having 2. And instead of spreading meager resources across 6 children, they concentrate their wealth, feeding and educating 2.
So birth rates drop, but at the exact same time, because of modern medicine, people are living longer. So look at the 65 and older population. In 1960, people 65 and older made up less than 5% of the global population. The world was overwhelmingly young.
Almost entirely.
Today, people 65 and older make up over 10% of the global population, almost 10%. The percentage of seniors has doubled.
And this introduces the concept of dependency ratios. This is how economists measure the burden on the working age population.
Let me see if I can map this out. A dependency ratio compares the people who are essentially dependent on the economy, children under 15, and seniors over 65, to the working age adults in the middle, ages 15 to 64.
Right. The 15 to 64 demographic is the engine. They pay the income taxes, they run the factories, they invent the software, and they fund the healthcare systems.
So if I look at the WDI data, I see 2 lines moving in completely opposite directions. The young dependency ratio children as a percentage of the working age population plummeted. Massive drop because people stopped having 6 kids.
Correct.
But the old age dependency ratio seniors as a percentage of the workers almost doubled. It shot up from like 8.6% to over 15%. If you graph this, the youth line plummets, the senior line shoots up, and they cross like a pair of scissors, the demographic scissors.
And understanding those scissors is the key to understanding why the global economy exploded and why it's currently slowing down. For the last several decades, the global economy was playing on easy mode. We were enjoying what economists call the demographic dividend.
I hear that term thrown around a lot. Give me a concrete example of a country going through this dividend. Make it tangible.
Let's look at South Korea. In the 1950s and 60s, post-war South Korea had very high birth rates, lots of kids. But as their economy stabilized and healthcare improved, their birth rates began to drop sharply in the 70s and 80s.
Okay, so the youth dependency burden shrinks. Fewer mouths to feed, fewer primary schools to build.
Right. This is the crucial part. That massive generation of kids born in the 50s and 60s grew up and entered the workforce in the 1980s and 90s.
Oh, I see.
So suddenly, South Korea had a massive swollen middle class of prime-age workers. They had very few young children to pay for, and because life expectancy hadn't fully extended into the 80s and 90s yet, they had very few elderly retirees to support.
It's like having a household where 5 adults are working full-time jobs, and there's only 1 kid and no grandparents to take care of. The amount of disposable income and tax revenue would be astronomical.
Exactly. That is the demographic dividend. It is pure macroeconomic rocket fuel. South Korea used that massive surplus of productive labor and capital to industrialize, build export markets, and become a high-tech powerhouse. And the entire world experienced a version of this from the 1980s through the 2010s. We had a tsunami of cheap, productive labor flooding the global market, with relatively few dependents dragging it down.
But a dividend implies a temporary payout. It's not permanent.
It is fiercely temporary, because that massive bulge of workers eventually gets old, and because they had so few children, there's a tiny generation of young workers behind them to replace them. The dividend turns into a deficit.
And Japan is the classic example here.
Look at Japan today. They are essentially 20 years ahead of the rest of the world on this curve. They have an upside-down population pyramid.
Lots of retirees at the top, a shrinking base of young workers at the bottom.
And the macroeconomic consequences of that upside-down pyramid are brutal. An old-age dependency ratio, climbing toward 20% or 30%, means a shrinking tax base has to fund a massively expanding demand for pensions and end-of-life health care. It forces governments into impossible choices.
Like raising taxes on the young to punishing
Or
levels.
slashing benefits for the elderly, or printing money and taking on massive debt.
If you are listening to this right now, this is why I said this data is the invisible hand reaching into your wallet. Look at your own paycheck. Look at the debates in your country. Have you noticed the official retirement age creeping up? Have you seen healthcare premiums exploding? Have you seen massive political fights over immigration policy, trying to import fresh young labor to prop up the tax base?
It is all driven by the demographic scissors. We built an economic model predicated on an endlessly expanding pool of young labor, and the WDI data proves that the pool is drying up. If you have fewer workers, each remaining worker must become significantly more productive just to maintain the status quo.
Which explains the massive pivot toward automation, artificial intelligence, and robotics. We aren't just automating to save money, we are automating because we literally won't have the human bodies to do the work.
We have to substitute capital and technology for labor.
But running all that technology, running the $100 trillion multinational conglomerate, requires an ocean of energy, and that energy comes with severe collateral damage.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most urgent layer of the WDI data, the hidden tab, the environmental and structural debt we accumulated to get here.
Because we didn't just borrow from the future demographically, we borrowed heavily from the earth.
We talked earlier about adjusted savings and chopping down the forest to fake a high GDP. Now we need to look at the literal exhaust pipe of the global economy.
Right, and I was looking at the energy metrics, and at first glance, I was actually optimistic. Yeah, because the WDI tracks energy efficiency, right?
Yep.
Which is GDP per unit of energy use. And the numbers have steadily improved. We went from generating roughly $7 of GDP per kilogram of oil equivalent to over $8.2. Basically, we are squeezing more economic value out of every lump of coal or barrel of oil. Our engines are better, our logistics are optimized, our insulation is thicker.
We have become incredibly technologically efficient.
So my logical assumption was if we are more efficient, our energy use and our emissions should be dropping, right? But they aren't. Greenhouse gas emissions are still incredibly high. Why didn't efficiency save us?
Because of a deeply frustrating economic concept known as the Jevons Paradox.
The Jevons Paradox. We need to explain this clearly because it feels like the trap we are currently stuck in.
Yeah, it's a huge trap. So William Stanley Jevons was a 19th century economist observing the coal industry in Britain. Engineers had just invented much more efficient steam engines that required significantly less coal to do the same amount of work. The government naturally assumed coal consumption would drop because everyone needed less of it.
Makes perfect sense.
But the exact opposite happened. Total coal consumption skyrocketed.
Why?
Because the new, highly efficient engines made steam power radically cheaper. It removed the financial friction. So instead of just using the new engines to pump water out of mines, people started putting them in trains and textile mills and ships. They found entirely new ways to consume the cheaper energy. Increased efficiency led to a massive increase in total usage that completely wiped out the efficiency gains.
I heard a great analogy for this recently regarding urban planning, building wider highways. If a city has terrible traffic, the logical solution is to add 2 more lanes to the highway to make it more efficient. But what happens?
Reduce demand.
Right. The traffic gets slightly better for a month, but then because the commute is easier, people decide they can live further out in the suburbs. Businesses build new retail centers along the highway. Within 5 years, the wider highway is completely gridlocked again, but now you have twice as many cars sitting in traffic, emitting twice as much pollution.
That is the Jevons Paradox in action. Yes, the global economy is more energy efficient today per unit of GDP. But because we grew the total GDP 70-fold, our absolute emissions grew massively. Per capita, greenhouse gas emissions are stuck around 6.1 to 6.3 tons. We didn't save energy, we just invented new ways to spend it. We built server farms, global supply chains, and 1 billion air conditioners.
And the WDI data quantifies the damage of those emissions in a very stark, unemotional way. I'm looking at the metric for adjusted savings related to particulate emission damage. This tracks the economic cost of PM2.5, the fine particulate matter pollution from vehicle exhaust, coal plants, and industrial fires that gets deep into human lungs.
It causes respiratory disease, heart disease, and premature death. It's a massive public health crisis. The data shows global average exposure is hovering around 39 micrograms per cubic meter, which is way, way above the WHO guideline of 5 micrograms.
But the WDI doesn't just track the health data, it tracks the financial cost. The data shows an adjusted savings cost reaching over $5.88 trillion
Almost $6 trillion.
annually. And I want to be incredibly clear to the listener here. We are not talking about politics. This isn't an activist projection or an ideological debate. The WDI treats that $5.88 trillion as a pure macroeconomic friction point. It is recorded in the ledger. It represents lost workdays, overwhelmed hospital system, and human capital degradation.
If your global GDP is $100 trillion, but you are losing almost $6 trillion purely to the health and productivity damages of breathing dirty air, you are running a highly inefficient machine. It is a massive tax on human prosperity. And that's just particulate matter. It doesn't even begin to account for the long-term structural costs of changing weather patterns impacting agricultural yields, or the depletion of freshwater aquifers, or the fact that forest cover has dropped from 33% to 31.2% since 1990.
And this environmental debt hits hardest exactly where financial debt is already becoming a crisis. Let's look at the data regarding the developing world. We have this metric tracking multilateral debt service alongside the poverty gap data. I want to spend some time here, because we cannot just look at global averages and pretend everyone is experiencing this $100 trillion economy equally.
We absolutely cannot.
That
A global average often hides profound regional suffering.
Explain the mechanism of this debt trap for developing nations. Why are they taking on so much multilateral debt in the first place?
Imagine you are the finance minister of a developing country today. Your population is growing, but they are suffering from that learning poverty we discussed, and your infrastructure is poor. You look at the wealthy nations and you see that the path to prosperity, the way out of agricultural poverty, is rapid industrialization. You need deep water ports, you need a stable electrical grid, you need modern highways.
You need to build the scaffolding so your children stop dying and your economy can grow, but you don't have the domestic tax revenue to pay for it.
Exactly. Your tax base is too small. So you go to multilateral institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, or you issue sovereign bonds to international investors, and you borrow billions of dollars. You take on debt to build the infrastructure, assuming the economic growth will eventually pay off the debt. That is exactly what the United States and Europe did in the 19th and 20th centuries.
But the game has changed, hasn't it?
The rules are completely different now. When the West industrialized, they had access to cheap, unregulated environmental capital. They could burn coal without limit, they could dump waste into rivers, and they didn't have to account for carbon emissions. They essentially spent the Earth's natural capital to build their wealth.
So the easy, dirty path to wealth is closed.
It's closed. The developing nations today are trying to climb the exact same ladder, but the environmental capital is gone. Furthermore, they're taking on this massive debt in an era of extreme climate volatility.
Let me see if I can connect the dots here. A developing nation borrows $2 billion to build a massive new agricultural irrigation system and a coastal highway to export their crops. They price out the debt payments over 20 years. But then, because of changing weather patterns driven by historic global emissions, they get hit by a historic drought that ruins the crop, followed by a supercyclone that washes out the brand new highway.
That is exactly what happens. The infrastructure they borrowed money to build is destroyed before it can generate the revenue to pay back the loan. Because their economy just took a massive hit, their local currency devalues against the U.S. dollar.
Oh man, and their multilateral debt is usually denominated in U.S. dollars.
Yes. So suddenly, the amount of their annual budget they have to dedicate just to paying the interest on the loan explodes. The WDI data shows some developing nations spending massive percentages of their gross national income purely on debt service.
And if you were spending 20% of your national budget servicing foreign debt, what are you not spending money on?
You aren't hiring teachers to solve the learning poverty. You aren't building cold chain infrastructure to distribute vaccines. You aren't funding female entrepreneurship programs. The debt service crowds out domestic human capital investment.
It's a vicious cycle. They are trying to build their own multinational conglomerates, but the environmental and financial interest rates are punitive. It creates this deeply complex global tension where the developing world is essentially being asked to pay the environmental tab for the last 60 years of Western industrialization while simultaneously struggling to fund their own basic survival.
It is the ultimate structural challenge of the 21st century. How do you lift the remaining billions out of poverty without triggering an environmental and financial collapse? The low-hanging fruit has been picked. The era of brute force, cheap energy, demographic dividend growth is over.
We've mentioned logistics a few times, and before we wrap up, I want to touch on the LPI, the Logistics Performance Index, because it ties into this idea of structural bottlenecks.
Oh, absolutely. The LPI is crucial.
The data shows global logistics tracking ability is around 2.7 to 3.0 on a 5-point scale, but the real bottleneck is customs efficiency, right?
Yes, clearing customs is still a massive friction point. Even as air freight volumes climb, indicating more high-value supply chains, the physical and bureaucratic borders remain stubborn. You can have digital leapfrogging with mobile phones, but a physical shipping container still have to clear customs.
Right, you can't digitize an avocado.
Exactly.
So we've pulled apart the major gears of this giant machine. We've looked at the money, the health, the demographics, the education, and the environmental debt. Let's pull back and look at the entire dashboard one more time. Let's synthesize the journey we just went on.
We started with a world in 1960 that was relatively poor, very young, and tragically short-lived. A world where a third of the adults couldn't read, and infant mortality was a ubiquitous reality.
We transformed that world from a $1.3 trillion mom-and-pop shop where you essentially flipped a coin to live past 50 into a $100 trillion hyper-connected global behemoth where you can expect to live past 71. We built digital networks, we practically eradicated illiteracy, and we saved tens of millions of infant lives. It is, without a doubt, a triumph.
But the data shows we traded high mortality problems for aging population problems. We beat infant mortality, which predictably collapsed the birth rate, which means we now have an upside-down population pyramid. We have a massive, swelling demographic of seniors relying on a shrinking base of workers.
And we financed this entire miraculous transformation by borrowing heavily against the natural environment, racking up a multi-trillion-dollar annual bill in pollution and resource depletion that is crippling the developing world's ability to catch up.
So if we look at the WDI data as a roadmap, what does this all mean for the future?
That's the $100 trillion question. So what does it mean?
It means the entire operating system of human progress has to change. To simply maintain the incredibly high baseline of health and wealth we have built, we require extreme efficiency. We can't rely on an endless supply of cheap young labor, so we need radical technological and healthcare innovation to manage the aging population affordably. We have to solve learning poverty and dismantle the barriers to female labor because we need every single ounce of human ingenuity off the bench and in the game.
We have to get smarter because we can't just throw bodies and coal at our problems anymore.
Exactly. We have to transition to sustainable, inclusive practices, not out of pure altruism, but because the macroeconomic math simply will not balance if we keep incurring a $6 trillion air pollution tab and crushing developing nations with structural debt.
That leaves me with a final thought for you, the listener. Something to mull over as you go back to your day, whether you are driving to work, looking at your budget, or thinking about the trajectory of your own industry. We spent the last 60 years using data to optimize for more. More money, more people, more years of life, more extraction, and we won that game. But the next 60 years will force us to optimize for better. Better quality of life, better efficiency, better cognitive education, better environmental balance. If you live long enough to become part of that expanding global senior demographic, which you likely will, thanks to the data we discussed today, what kind of economic and environmental foundation will you be standing on? Will the scaffolding hold?
It is the defining challenge of our generation to make sure it does.
It's been an incredible, eye-opening journey through the numbers today. We went from the illusion of $100 trillion to the silent miracles of public health, and the picture is just as complex and demanding as we promised. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the World Development Indicators. Remember, don't just read the headlines. Always keep questioning the numbers behind them and look for the hidden costs.
And pay attention to the footnotes. That's where the future is actually being written.
See you next time.